All right, we're live. Hi and welcome to Red Reviews. Although I guess we're not reviewing a book this time. Sort of.
That's just
yeah,
the name of our show.
yeah, that's right. So
Excuse me. Oh my goodness, what a horrible way to start a live stream. Good evening, Corey. How's it going, man?
uh, uh, it could be better. I'm a little sick, but
Oh man.
I'm toughing it out.
All right. Well, we can have a hard cutoff if you're like, I gotta go, I'm done.
Yeah, we may have to, but we'll
That's
see how it
totally
goes.
fine. That's totally fine. Thank you to anybody who will join our live stream tonight. I'm hoping to see some of our regulars, maybe some random geek will be joining us tonight.
That would be good. Yeah.
If not, then obviously this becomes more content that we can share out later. But anyway, so tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about another book that I read this year and kind of riff on it and have some fun with it, I think, which is there's this great book that came out about 10 years ago called Rich People Things.
Right.
It's a book by Chris Lehman, or Lehman. I'm not sure how to say his last name. He's a writer for The Nation magazine. He's a writer for The Baffler, which is an incredible magazine that's been going for God knows how many years, that Thomas Frank was a big part of. The guy who wrote What's the Matter with Kansas and a bunch of other things. It's a really interesting and fun book about like social criticism of sort of like, what are things that rich people that sort of embody rich people? And so he has like a list of like things that he thinks embodies rich people, and sort of the things that he's like, this is definitely something that like rich people either love or that they perpetuate or that they're just enamored with or whatever. And so I have an older edition of the book that doesn't have a couple of the other ones he put in the new edition, but there's still 26 of them. So we'll go through and have some fun with it. But I thought maybe what we do tonight is kind of go through his list and kind of go, that's a good one to put on the list, and kind of explain why. I'll kind of give you his reasons why, but then also like, how would we update the list? Who would we put on? What would we put on the list today? So that'll be what we'll spend our discussion about.
Wait, what year did you say he wrote this?
So this book came out in 2010.
Oh, so there's a lot of stuff that's kind of changed.
There's a lot of shit that's happened in the last, 13 years. And I think the newer edition came out in like 2011 or 2012. So it's been about 10 years.
Still, yeah.
And so, so it's basically kind of going through, and some of these that he has on this list are absolutely evergreen. They're ones that would always be on the list no matter what time.
Right.
There are other ones that are on the list, but they're a little more time contingent. That who would we replace this with now?
Okay.
So like I said, the list we're going to go through is 26. And then there's one of them that's from the new edition that I remember off the top of my head. So like 27. Okay. But then we'll sort of think about, okay, well, would we really put this on the list today? Probably we would put somebody else.
Right.
So, so he starts this with a really great sentence. The book starts with this great sentence that kind of sets up our discussion tonight. American class privilege is very much like the idea of sex in a Catholic school. It's not supposed to exist in the first place, but once it presents itself in your mind's eye, you realize that it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Which is very funny.
Yep.
And this book is very, very funny. It's both searing criticism. You learn some interesting stuff, and then also it's funny, which is always good, I think, for books, because I know some folks, and we've talked about this before, I know some folks have trouble with theory, or they have, maybe reading's not the easiest thing for you, which, hey man, I get that. I can't play video games for shit. So like, right. So,
some people have strengths, some people
have weaknesses, right? So I get it. So, so this is kind of a fun look at the way in which extreme wealth and extreme inequality creates these like cultural touchstones that are fucked up,
right?
That are kind of weird and strange. So the first one on the list is the U.S. Constitution, and
that's a rich people thing.
It is a rich people thing, and so here's his logic for this is. And it's very solid. And a lot of it comes from if anybody's ever read People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn or other books, Gerald Horne's book, research, like you get a sense of this is exactly right. People think of the U.S. Constitution as being like this, like, revered document that comes upon from high. And the founding fathers are like the 12 apostles distilling their wisdom for the people. And some of that is kind of true in the sense that like we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, like there's some things that are decent about the Constitution, like the First Amendment,
Sure.
due process under the law, habeas corpus. There are some good things about the Constitution. The income tax, the right of women to vote, the right of African Americans to vote, banning of slavery. Except for as a punishment of a crime, which we can then get into.
Yeah. A couple of those didn't come in the first draft,
In fact, the ones that I just named, none of them came in the first draft. They were all a part of the Bill of Rights, which was their 10. Oops, we left these out.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that for a quick second. I don't know if this was in Layman's book because I can't remember, but this is an interesting. So during the debate of the Constitution, there was a serious debate about whether or not there should be enumerations of rights. Alexander Hamilton's logic was, well, whatever rights that we don't explicitly enumerate in the Constitution are ones that are already granted by society. So like the Constitution is essentially a document that tells you what the government does. And if government and whatever things the government doesn't do are left for the people to be able to do, therefore they would have these rights. That was kind of the logic, that by not including anything, we're actually sort of including everything implicitly.
Okay.
James Madison, sort of known as the father of the Constitution, and a short king, I think he was like 5'4", he basically said, actually, no, we shouldn't do that. That's a terrible idea.
Okay.
Because if you don't enumerate specific rights, the government can usurp them. And so you have to clearly lay out what rights the public does have,
right,
so that the government cannot explicitly try to usurp them without the public's knowledge and without their consent. Essentially, that's kind of the argument.
Okay.
And so that's why the Bill of Rights were included. And the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. And the 10th Amendment is actually a fairly important one, and it's one that actually reaffirms what Hamilton's ideas were in the first place, which is the 10th Amendment is essentially the federalism clause of the Bill of Rights. It basically says that which powers which are not granted to the federal government are granted to the states and or the people respectively. So like whatever the federal government does, the federal government does. Whatever the state governments do, state governments do. And things that are not left to the states or to the federal government are left to the people. It's that delineation, right? You can read the term of the people in many different ways. You could refer to the people as individual citizens. You could refer to the people as local governments, so like cities, municipalities, townships, things like that. But federalism is built in. And sometimes federalism is a good thing. In the case of like right now, in the post-Roe landscape, there are states that have codified abortion rights into law. Yeah. That's federalism working for good. Yeah. But federalism can also work for fucking evil in the case of abortion rights, where states pass abortion bans. Yeah. So this is the nature of the Constitution. But the reason that Layman includes this on the list is that the Constitution, really at the end of the day, is a property document. It spends a hell of a lot more of its time talking about what property is granted to whom and for what reason than it does explaining political rights. And so the founders were men of property. Many of them owned people as property. Yep. And so the Constitution was originally written to protect their property and also specifically the property that they owned that were people. Yep. And so, for example, in the Constitution, there was originally a thing called the 3/5 Compromise. The 3/5 Compromise said, because in the South, Black slaves overwhelmingly outnumbered the white people who lived in the southern states. Right. So if they were included in the populations, if they weren't included in the populations, for the purposes of like congressional districts and allocation of federal funds and voting in the Electoral College, the South would have almost no power because most people lived in the North. Most white people lived in the North. White people of property lived in the North. So the 3/5 Compromise counted slaves as 3/5 of a person.
Right. To kind of balance out.
To balance it out. Basically to give the South power that they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Right.
And of course, this ends up being repealed by the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery again, with the exception of a punishment as a crime.
Right.
But yeah, so the Constitution spends a tremendous amount of time figuring out, okay, well, how does the government collect taxes? How does the government print money? Because the Constitution explicitly says that the government coins money and not prints money. So like that's where people get into the argument that like, how do you read that? Do you read that very like literally, where it's like, do you have to make them out of metal? It has to be a gold standard, or do you read that sort of metaphorically, like, oh, they have the right to create money?
Right.
Because back then most money was in coin.
Yeah.
And what wasn't in coin was known as what was called specie, or basically notes that you would then, or specie was like the metal, but then you had promissory notes.
Okay.
As a sort of a form of paper money that could then be exchanged for gold, silver, any other precious metals, or other goods.
Okay.
And so that's pretty much why the Constitution is a rich people thing. And I would argue that it is still a rich people thing, because the way that the Constitution has been interpreted over the last 200 plus some odd years has been essentially to defend property above human beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, for example, the 14th Amendment, which was originally added during the Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, the Constitution. 13th banned slavery. The 14th was basically the Due Process Amendment
Okay.
and Citizenship Amendment. The 15th Amendment was the Black Suffrage Amendment. And what the 14th Amendment explicitly was written about was to guarantee the equal protection under the law for all citizens.
Okay.
The 14th Amendment also includes birthright citizenship, which is something that conservatives have wanted to get rid of for a long time.
Yeah, right.
The reason that they included birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment was explicitly because people had made the argument that slaves were not citizens of the United States. Because essentially they weren't considered people.
Yeah.
And so when you then made them no longer slaves, they then became residents of the United States. Well, in order to make them citizens of the United States very easily, you give them birthright citizenship that makes all of the former slaves citizens of the United States. That's how they did it. Pretty clever and smart, very easy way of getting that all done. The problem is that the 14th Amendment, for most of its history, has actually really been used more for the protection of corporations than for the protection of people.
Of course.
So basically, you know how the idea of a corporation is a person with specific rights?
Yeah.
That is through an interpretation of the 14th Amendment.
It's nonsense, but
it is nonsense. And in some respects, corporations in the United States actually have more rights and privileges granted to them by the legal system than people do.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's how the U.S. Constitution is a rich people thing.
That's fair. I can agree with that.
So I think that's one that would stay on the list. I don't know if I would put it at number one, but it's a good one.
Yeah.
Number two is the New York Times.
Definitely.
So, do we have to explain this one?
Non-sequently said, aren't all laws rich people things? Some days I feel that way.
No,
Yes,
you're right.
I would agree.
So most of the time law is created, especially, so the U.S. Constitution, the Canadian legal system is based on English common law, which was developed basically to protect property. I mean, most of it is to protect property. So in that essence, most laws are rich people things because it's about protecting property above protecting human beings. So great point.
Yeah.
Non-sequently. That's a fun name too. So thank you. So the New York Times. I don't think this one has to be explained as much as the Constitution.
That's definitely true.
The New York Times panders to its upper middle class, rich. Yeah, the New York Times is definitely self-explanatory. Yeah, and so I'll just mention a couple of things here.
Sure.
Which is that obviously they wrote things that were very positive of Mussolini. They also wrote things that were very positive of Hitler.
Yeah.
They also tried to go out of their way to shit on American Austrian Hungarian American Victor Berger, who was a socialist who was being persecuted during World War I for essentially violating the Sedition Act by writing a socialist newspaper that was critical of World War I.
Okay.
And the New York Times basically tried to throw him under the bus because they didn't think of him as being American enough. So they'll slam an American citizen defending. They'll slam an American.
Got a comment on YouTube.
Levi Tooker says, "You can't even read the New York Times without money. It's hidden. It's all hidden by the paywall." That's exactly right.
Yeah,
that is exactly right. And most newspapers are like that. You know, "Democracy dies in darkness" is like the headline, is like the byline of like the Washington Post, right? Which you could also put on this fucking list because it's literally owned by a multi-billionaire plutocrat, Jeff Bezos. "Democracy dies in darkness" articles are behind a paywall. So but great point. Thank you so much, Levi. I appreciate it. But yeah, great point that it's basically behind a paywall. But yeah, the New York Times will slam an American defending the First Amendment, but will say nice things about Hitler. So there's that. The New York Times has always been the voice of the reactionary upper class. It's a way. It's the paper of record for those who wish to continue to maintain this sort of media hierarchy that perpetuates the class system and that perpetuates the sort of liberal bourgeois ethos. And one of those that they sort of, one idea of that they sort of try to like to maintain, and the liberal bourgeois world likes to, especially the neoliberal world, is number 3 on our list, which is meritocracy.
Oh yeah, the myth.
Meritocracy is is a myth. So in this chapter, he does a wonderful job of explaining that the term meritocracy itself came from a British author who wrote it in a science fiction dystopian novel, basically explaining how the concept of meritocracy was bullshit. Like it's like the phrase, like, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. People don't remember that the origin of that term is that no one can pick themselves up by their bootstraps. That's
the joke point. Is that it's impossible.
You know, it's like when people say with cops, like, there's a few bad apples. Well, finish the aphorism, please. A few bad apples spoils the bunch. That's literally the aphorism. They always cut it off at the half. But it's the same thing with meritocracy. So it was always a term that was used ironically to critique systems of hierarchy. That was the goal from the outset. But because Americans are so fucking literal, cannot even remotely entertain ideas of irony most of the time, we took it as being serious. And so now today, meritocracy is used as sort of a cudgel to shut people up when they're demanding higher wages, they're demanding better benefits, they're demanding more time off. And that's how you get into the idea of skilled versus unskilled labor, which those terms are all bullshit. I know you posted a great meme about that recently. And because all labor is skilled labor. It all is, you know. Yes, I work on a computer all day. Could I work at McDonald's? No, that job would be too hard for me. I'm literally too dumb and too poorly coordinated to do that job. I don't think I could. And I don't think I'd have the emotional strength to do that job. So this idea that it's not skilled is nonsense. There's a tremendous amount of skill that goes into being somebody who works at McDonald's, or somebody who works as a construction worker, or somebody who works as a software developer. They all are things that are skilled, right? But meritocracy is a way of basically separating certain parts of the working class from itself. But it's the calling card of most of the mainstream Democratic Party, mainstream American politics, but especially the mainstream Democratic Party, right? It's the whole Obama thing, where if you work hard and you play by the rules, you should be able to get by, you know? That's almost never the case.
Before we move on to number 4, Kerrigan has a comment on YouTube that may kind of derail us a little bit, but hey, Justin, I know you like the Libertarian Socialism book. So as I'm one who knows that there are 2 currents within the Libertarian Socialism school of thought, anarchism and Libertarian Marxism. Would you like being defined as a Libertarian Marxist?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think if the term libertarian didn't have such terrible baggage in the United States, yes. I would describe myself as like a Libertarian Socialist, Libertarian Marxist, yes. I think that as I've evolved in my thought, I'm getting closer and closer to people like CLR James and Daniel Guerin and Raya Denidyevskaya. It's the intersection for me of the libertarian Marxism and Marxist humanism. Those are the two things that I kind of gravitate towards the most.
Yep. Right
so I have a lot of kinship with anarchism in terms of our general goals, because as somebody who was a former Leninist and was involved in Leninist organizations, I can tell you, I just don't think that's the answer. Not just on a practical level,
that's fair,
but on a moral level, I just don't think it is.
Yeah.
So
there seemed to be a conflict with the humanist aspect of your perspective.
Very much the humanist aspect of what I believe in. And if you want to learn more, check out the episode I did with Corey about leaving Leninism.
Yeah, that's right.
Great little segue there.
Yeah.
Excellent comment. Thank you, Kerrigan. I appreciate it. And I just want to sincerely appreciate your interest in the show and giving us feedback and giving us ideas for titles to do on the show. We've tried to work a lot of those into the lineup. And so thank you so much for being a really enthusiastic and engaged supporter of our work.
For sure.
So I think all three of those are ones that we would keep, right?
Yep, I think so.
Number 4 is populism. Now this one sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I'm going to buy that.
But I think but here's where he's going with this, right? So something happened. What he means by that is that rich people use populism as a scare tactic to sort of circumvent or undermine any form of democratic politics. So anytime that you have people like us who are calling for essentially an expansion of democracy, not just in the political realm, but in the economic realm, people will cry, "Oh, well, that's populism, and populism is scary," and they'll sort of trot out things about populism that they think are dangerous. So it's essentially this idea that we can't trust the rabble of the mob, to make right political decisions. We can't trust the people because they don't know what they need. We know what they need.
You see, you saw a lot of that during the when Donald Trump was elected, right? It was a lot of pundits would blame it on populism,
right?
Which was absolutely false in my opinion.
I agree with you completely. Or at the very least, we need to delineate what it was, which was a sort of right-wing populism. Yeah. Which I know sounds kind of counterintuitive, but there is this sort of stream of right-wing populism in the United States. There are strong currents of it. And so Trump didn't happen in a vacuum. So probably the most influential right-wing populist of the last 40 years is Pat Buchanan, who had worked for Richard Nixon and who ran for president in 1992 and had a serious primary challenge against then President George H.W. Bush.
Right.
Pat Buchanan was kind of the Trump before Trump. A lot of the things that Trump was talking about, his anti-immigrant ideas, his sort of, his sort of anti-LGBTQ ideas, or those sort of tolerance and pluralism, all those come from Pat Buchanan.
Right.
And here's what makes Buchanan interesting, is that Buchanan is a Catholic. So this is where, because the populist movement generally is anti-Catholic. And the right-wing populists, whether you go back to the Know Nothing Party of the 1840s, all the way up through the John Birch Society in the 1950s, they tend to be anti-Black, and they tend to be anti-Jewish, and they tend to be anti-Catholic.
Yeah, wasn't there when JFK was elected president, wasn't there a big backlash because they were worried that the Pope or the Vatican would be actually running the country?
Exactly. In the history of the United States, there's only been a few Roman Catholics ever to vie for the presidency, let alone have it. So the first Roman Catholic to be nominated by a major political party in the United States was Al Smith, who was the Democratic governor of New York, and when he ran against Herbert Hoover in 1928. He lost to Hoover in the 28 election. The second one is John F. Kennedy, who won, and he gave a speech in 1960 kind of laying out his ideas. And I'm not a huge Kennedy fan, but this speech is actually one of the better speeches ever given by a presidential candidate on the issue of separation of church and state.
Right.
Which is one of the better things of the U.S. Constitution. And then, of course, Joe Biden. Joe Biden is a Roman Catholic. So it took 60 years
Right.
for
Yeah.
another president to be Catholic. But then here's the weird part. A good chunk of the U.S. Supreme Court are Catholics.
Hmm.
So,
That's interesting.
so that's an interesting part of it. But then I always make the joke that the reason why there's so many right-wing Catholics on the Supreme Court is because Catholics are the only right-wingers that read. But yeah, so no, it's almost all for a long time. The U.S. Supreme Court was pretty much all Catholics and Jews,
right.
Which is so interesting when you think about like the history of the United States, and
Yeah.
that the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, who was Louis Brandeis. So like Senate confirmations weren't really a big thing with Supreme Court justices until Louis Brandeis. And that's when the U.S. Senate decided to have more, like basically more hearings to grill him about being a U.S. Supreme Court justice. And the only real reason they did it was because he was a Jew. So the U.S., like the whole, like the grilling of the senators thing, like they do today, you know, presidents could do recess appointments. Lincoln did that during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Where you could just put people on the court. The president
just a rubber stamp, more or less.
Yeah. The president has the discretion to do these things. You know, it's they just often don't use that power. Republicans are much more comfortable with executive power than Democrats are. But that's sort of populism as a term of derision.
Right.
And so, yeah.
So I guess in that sense, yes, it is a rich people thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like true populism isn't really a rich people thing, but
yeah,
to use it in that denigrating way.
Exactly. So the way that populism is a rich people thing is sort of a two-pronged part. One, it's used as a means to sort of throw any kind of left politics under the bus,
right,
or any kind of just democratic politics broadly. And then two is the right-wing populism, where they're using like terms like the people and like I'm here for the common man and all this kind of shit. When in reality, they're actually just toadies for power. And privilege. So that's populism. Number 5, this is kind of, I think, the first one where it might be a little dated. I don't know who we'd put in this slot today, but number 5 is David Brooks.
Okay.
So David Brooks is a columnist for the New York Times. He's best known for books like Bobo's in Paradise, and he writes a lot about like how to live a good life, that kind of shit.
Okay.
Not to be confused with Arthur Brooks, who's also a columnist who also writes about the same fucking thing.
Okay.
One of them's bald and one of them isn't, but they both wear glasses.
But
I'm not going to tell you which one.
I don't
care. So David Brooks, so like he is basically this right-wing, you know, columnist for the New York Times who kind of writes like man on the street thing. And he had this like absolutely atrocious thing that he wrote once where he was like, I went to the Midwest and I hung out with this person. We went to a Mexican restaurant. I couldn't spend more than $20. Now this was like 2005. So like, I'm pretty damn sure you could spend $20 in Mexican place. In fact, I guarantee you're probably spending more if it's both of you, you know, if it was like a taco truck maybe, but like, it didn't appear to me. But anyway, I don't know who we'd put in this slot today. I mean, I think there's certain people you could like Barry Weiss.
Yeah.
Put Barry Weiss in that.
She's awful.
She's awful. And turns out she's basically on the payroll of Harlan Crow, just like Clarence Thomas is.
No, yeah.
Who else? You know, probably somebody like Brett Stevens, who writes the New York Times, because David Brooks is still there. And he's still writing, and it's terrible. His hot takes are garbage.
So he still gets his role in some way.
I can't remember if Thomas Friedman's on this list. I hate Thomas Friedman too. He's a colossal moron. Yes, like David Brooks, Thomas Friedman. Basically, we could replace the David Brooks as a specific to the general of the New York Times and or Atlantic opinion page.
Yes, I was just thinking the Atlantic.
Pretty terrible, like just awful.
Yeah.
And again, just constantly reaffirms. Jeff Thomas Black says, "Hey guys. Hello. Thank you for joining us, Jeff. Appreciate it." So yeah, that basically, you know, shitty opinion pages in mainstream newspapers. That pretty much covers it. Number 6 is the free market. which
Yep,
is definitely
that's
a rich people thing.
yep, that's
Um,
definitely a rich people thing.
the thing I'll basically mention about this is that the idea is um, what was I going to say? Sorry. Basically, the thing about the free market is that it's a myth. It's not real.
Right,
Markets are
right.
established by the rules of the road, which are established by governments.
Yeah,
Markets are created by governments, and
yeah,
governments are often then shaped by the ways in which markets then develop.
yeah. That's right.
So, because capitalism doesn't have a free market, if anything, it lends itself towards cartelization and centralization.
Yeah,
If anybody,
monopolization.
yeah, if anybody wants to learn any more about that, I highly recommend people read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. Number 6 is the stock market,
I agree.
which I think is, again, I think it goes part and parcel with the free
Yep.
market. The vast majority of Americans do not invest in individual stocks. About half of the American populace have some involvement in the stock market, but the vast majority have it through 401ks or index
Right.
funds or any kind of retirement accounts, IRAs, and things like that.
Yeah.
So
Through the company they work
through the
for.
company they work for. And so I do. I have what's
Yeah.
called a 403b because I work for the government, so
Wow.
I don't have a 401k.
Okay.
But yeah, the stock market is crap. I think he spends a chunk of this chapter talking about how in 2005 and 6, the Bush administration was pushing to privatize Social Security and make it something that would be individual private accounts that would be set by the stock
Jeez.
market. And then the economy absolutely took a colossal shit. But even back then, there was fierce opposition to privatizing Social Security, as there should be today, because you would think that the Republicans would realize that not only is that politically bad, it's practically bad, like just on an economic level.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're still trying to push it. They're still trying to push privatizing
course they
Social
are.
Security.
Because
fuck
they
that.
don't work for you. They don't work for the people.
Right. So number 8 is quote unquote, he's got this in quotes, class warfare. That's number 8.
All right, let's clarify what's going on there.
So class war, what he means by that is basically that it's kind of the term like populism, right? Where the right wing or the establishment uses the term class warfare to truncate any kind of discussion about economic inequality. So they use the whole, and this is the kind of fucking argument you'll hear from like neoliberals, or the kind of argument you'll hear from like, dipshits who used to hang out with Jeffrey Epstein, like Steven Pinker, where he says the point is not a better division of the pie. The point is to make a bigger pie. But that is a profoundly stupid way of looking at it, because when the pie gets bigger, that means that your share of it that you had before gets smaller, and the share of the rich gets bigger.
Yeah.
So even though you may have a little more in total, in terms of the percentage, you actually have
pie got bigger. So
the pie got bigger. So it actually, you got fucked. Like, it's just a stupid way of looking at the world. And so, but yeah, the idea of, well, this is just class warfare. Well, here's the thing. The people who are wealthy in this society, the rich people who run this fucking place, they are committing class warfare every single day. They know their class interest, and they fight for it every single day, And so the question is, and I think a lot of mainstream politicians say this all the time. Bernie Sanders says this all the time, where it's like, there is class warfare in this country. It's class warfare of the rich against the poor.
Yeah,
and he's right. I mean, that's the real class warfare going on. So again, it's another one of those terms that the rich and the wealthy and the general reactionary use to stifle any mention of inequality.
Yeah, I can't say that I've heard that very recently. Like,
I haven't heard it either. I don't know what you would say now. It's class warfare is not a thing people say a lot. That was something that was definitely said a lot 10 years ago, and especially during the Obama era, we heard it a lot. I don't know what we would replace that with today.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but
probably like scare quotes Marxism, or I
could see that,
or like critical race theory, or other like scare shit that people get whipped up in a froth about that they don't really know, like woke. Like those are terms that could be used today as rich people things. Number 9 is the Democratic Party. Which I think is
I think that's
spot
fair.
on. So it talks about the decades-long abandonment of working people by the Democratic Party. He talks about the Democratic Leadership Council of the 1980s, which was led by people like Bill Clinton and Al Gore, to turn the Democratic Party away from unions and working class people to being the party of trial lawyers and special interest groups and high finance. They basically recognize they're like, look at all this fucking free flowing cash the Republicans are getting from finance. Let's do it too. And so that's part of the reason why the Democratic Party is a rich people thing. If you look at some of the most wealthy zip codes in America, they're Democratic zip codes. They're not Republican ones, because Democratic politics is centered in cities, and a lot of wealthy people are Democrats. Jeff Bezos is technically a Democrat, and so
Mr. Musk used to say that he was too.
Mr. Musk said he was a Democrat, right? Or Bill Gates,
until the unions got too strong.
Mm-hmm. So I think that the Democratic Party is absolutely a rich people thing. And in the sense that too, they also absorb radical energies and neutralize them. So that's the other thing too. So Democratic Party, not good. But the Republican Party is awful too. I would just say,
not going to pretend the other way.
I would change the Democratic Party to just be the property party, which is the term that Gore Vidal used to describe both the Republicans and Democrats. He said, we have one party in the United States, it's the property party, and it has two right wings, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. One is just a little bit nicer on the surface, and one is just a bit more draconian and direct about it. And it's often hard to tell which one is worse, because you could make the argument the draconian one is worse because it's much more overt. Somehow, I would also kind of make the argument maybe that the Democrats or the liberal party is worse in the sense that it's telling you all these nice things. It's trying to win you over with all of these nice sounding words and promises, and then they end up doing none of it. You know, which one's worse? Someone who stabs you in the front or stabs you in the back? It's
you're still getting stabbed either way. So.
And the Democrats are backstabbers. I mean, they're generally backstabbers, whereas the Republicans are front stabbers. They will stab you in the face. They don't give a shit. I always make the joke of like, if the political parties were a call center, the Republican line would be, "Hi, thanks for calling the Republican Party. Go fuck yourself." And the Democratic Party would be, "Hi, thanks for calling the Democratic Party. We see you and we hear you. Go fuck yourself." So I think that's absolutely right. Number 10 is the prosperity gospel. Which I think is very much true. This is something that comes out of right-wing evangelical Christianity. I actually wrote about the development, like the earlier sort of proto forms of this in my master's thesis. I wrote about an evangelical preacher named Dwight Moody, who had a very popular speech in the 1880s and 90s called Sowing and Reaping. And he basically makes the argument that what you reap is what you sow.
Right.
And he sort of said that if you sow, good behavior and thrift and industriousness, then you will reap the sort of the benefits and riches, right? It's kind of a form of meritocracy. The prosperity gospel in and of itself is kind of a form of meritocracy. The big difference is that meritocracy still has the appearance of that you have to work for it.
Right.
Whereas like the prosperity gospel is sort of this like,
send me money and I'll make you money rich and I will praying.
And if you have any indication that this is rich people shit, I highly recommend people watch John Oliver's video he did of Last Week Tonight, like 5 or 6 years ago on televangelists. It's excellent. Number 11, again, I think this one's one that's probably a little dated, is Wired Magazine.
Okay. Interesting.
I think it's
an interesting choice.
I think part of it is it's because he sort of criticizes the sort of techno-futuristic libertarianism of some of the early internet people like Kevin Kelly and John Perry Barlow and other people who sort of believed in this sort of techno-libertarian utopia that obviously didn't come to pass.
Yeah. I think it could be said that that's still a rich people thing, because they do still often like promote kind of like the tech billionaire kind of vision of the world, and like they're always talking about Mr. Musk and
big time. So number 12, this one I think is a little dated. I think it's absolutely dated. I think there's a term we would use today that is a more of a hot term, but number 12 is the creative class.
Interesting. Yeah.
So today we would call that the professional managerial class. the
Right.
PMC. It's kind of the term used now, but back when this was written, it was the creative class. The creative class was a term that was created by a sociologist named Richard Florida.
Okay.
He wrote a book called I think it's called like The Rise of the Creative Class or something like that. And what these people are they are highly educated mental workers in the economy. So we're talking
Okay.
about lawyers, software developers, marketers, graphic designers, people who they don't necessarily own companies, but they're not necessarily working class either. They sort of sit somewhere in the middle. And that's
Okay.
kind of what the professional managerial class is too, which was a term that was developed by Barbara Ehrenreich and I think somebody else whose name escapes me. But the professional managerial class are the sort of the echelon who make enough money to benefit from the system, but they're still closer to being homeless than they are to being Jeff Bezos, if that makes any sense.
So in what way are they a rich people thing?
So I think that the creative class is a rich people thing in the sense that it is obfuscating real class relations. So when we
Yeah.
create these terms like the creative class or the professional managerial class, or what is it? Yeah. So when I was talking about David Brooks earlier, we talked about his book Bobos in Paradise. Bobo
Okay.
is an acronym. It
Ah.
stands for Bohemian Bourgeois.
Oh,
So like
okay.
Bohemian bourgeoisie or the creative class or the professional managerial class, it is muddling class distinctions
Right.
in a very non-Marxist sense, where we are getting away from really the understanding that most human societies fit, especially industrial capitalist societies, sort of either have the proletariat or they have the bourgeoisie.
Right.
And the creative class or the PMC or whatever you want to call it is what Marx called petit bourgeois.
Right. Right. Right.
The intellectuals, the mental workers, the people who are often above the regular proletariat. So like depending on how you read it, like I could be considered a part of the creative class, even though I don't really see myself like that. I certainly don't make the money that the creative class does.
Right. Yeah.
I think that there's a great podcast called Books That Kill.
Oh yeah. Yep.
That
Michael Hobbs and
Michael Hobbs and Peter or something.
Yeah.
They did a great. Michael Hobbs is also the co-host of Maintenance Phase, which is a must-listen to podcast, which is incredible
absolutely.
with Aubrey Gordon. But I think they did a whole episode because Books That Kill. The premise of that episode, that book podcast, is reviewing shitty airport books that have had tremendous harm on our culture. And we'll definitely get into this when we talk about the next person on this list.
Nice.
The next rich people thing.
Is it Malcolm Gladwell?
It fucking is.
Oh fuck! Of course it is.
You're fucking right. You're fucking right. It is. Number 13 on the list is Malcolm fucking Gladwell. So they did a great series on Malcolm Gladwell crap on Books That Kill.
Yeah.
Basically, the big problem with Malcolm Gladwell is that first off, he might be a decent writer. He's able to sort of weave a story together,
Yep.
but he's a profoundly shitty author. So I've only read one of his books, and it's the book, I think it's called David and Goliath, I think is the book I read of his.
Okay.
His whole thing, like Malcolm Gladwell's whole shtick is there's sort of this common wisdom about certain things, but I'm going to tell you that there's a very counterintuitive way of understanding something, and it's probably bullshit.
Turns out it's mostly bullshit.
That's me going into my Michael Hobbs cadence, but basically, yeah. So what I think the biggest problem that layman has with Malcolm Gladwell, and I encourage people to listen to Books That Kill episodes on Malcolm Gladwell because they go into a lot of really interesting shit about why Malcolm Gladwell sucks.
Yeah.
First off, his books don't have anything that connect them together other than a premise. They're just a bunch of random. Yeah. They're just a bunch of random fucking stories. And I'm like, and the whole and it turns out that certain of his core insights, like the 10,000 hour rule, like you have to put in 10,000 hours before becoming an expert, is probably bullshit. That there's
he's actually not good at research very well.
No, he's terrible at it. No, because he's much more interested in telling a story than he is in giving you the truth. It's never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Is kind of the essence of the Malcolm Gladwell oeuvre, if you will.
Yeah.
But the big problem that Lehman has with him, if I remember right, is essentially that he naturalizes everything. So that basically, like, the reason that certain people do better than others is basically because of naturalistic. He's essentially a biological determinist, that he sort of thinks that
Right.
nature is far more important than nurture, and that those things are the things that really matter. And I think that that's bullshit. I think that there are people who are much smarter than Malcolm Gladwell, like Stephen Jay Gould or Richard Lewontin or others, who have laid out that he's full of shit.
Yeah. Right.
On that one. So yeah, Malcolm Gladwell. Who would we put on the list to replace him? Like, if we were going to update the list, who would put on it? For me, it would be Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson would be the person I would put in that list. Because I didn't think you could.
Yeah, you could leave Malcolm Gladwell there, but also
you could
add
absolutely
Jordan
leave him. So people, I think I've seen the meme, and maybe you have too, that Malcolm Gladwell is just liberal Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
and I think that's true.
Yeah, that's pretty true.
And yeah, so that's Malcolm Gladwell's the fucking worst. awful, sucks. Don't waste your time, folks.
Yeah,
don't waste your time. You will learn nothing. I guarantee it.
He'll fool you into thinking that he's clever, but actually he's full of shit.
Because he's just telling a fucking story. The Books That Kill guys also do an episode on Freakonomics and why Freakonomics sucks too.
Oh, yeah.
But that whole like Malcolm Gladwell, Freakonomics view of the world is just so nonsense. Like the vast majority, like sometimes the obvious answer is more than likely the right one. When we're talking about sociology or political economy, like sometimes it's pretty easy to see why certain things happen, right?
Yeah.
But they're like, well, we have to come up with this like counterintuitive, weird way of looking at it and getting to it. And it's like, no, sometimes it's actually fucking obvious.
Yeah, like actually didn't maybe I'm a little off base here, but I think the Freakonomics guys, like they kind of wrote about like how abortion had all these long-term effects, and like being the legalization of abortion had all these long-term effects on society, and
specifically the decline of crime.
And decline of crime. And it's like, okay, you can't actually draw those conclusions.
No.
There's too many variables like that you're just focusing on this one.
Yeah, there's way too many variables. It's kind of like saying that the reason the boomers are all fucked up is because they were around lead all the time.
Right.
So like some of that's the case, probably. But some of it's probably not, because there's a lot of people from that era who are totally fine and they're not fucked up.
That's right.
It very much like microplastics. Like we get scared about microplastics, but I guarantee you that we probably really won't know the long-term effects of microplastics until years down the road when more research is done. And chances are it's going to be something along the lines of like, it'll be a mix of like changing the law so that certain plastics aren't made, and then certain laws that are passed. Like it's exactly what they did with lead in the 1960s. It was basically we're getting lead out of the gas. We're getting lead out of paint. It's clear. It's very clear that it's dangerous to health. It's the thing with gas stoves, like the gas stoves controversy now, where gas stoves are fucking harmful. And all people of sensible public policy, I'm not talking about, there's nothing Marxist about taking away your fucking gas stove. Okay.
That's right.
Other than to appropriate it for the common area that we will make our food in, per our Bertrand Russell episode. But basically, but there is very strong evidence that built up over decades that having natural gas stoves in your home causes neurological problems.
Yeah,
and I know it. I can't prove it, but I know from my own experience. My grandmother used a gas stove her entire life, and she died of dementia. So I'm not saying that it couldn't have been other things. I'm just saying that it could have been
one potential factor.
This is one potential factor, right? And so the goal was never, we're going to rip the stoves out. The jackbooted thugs are going to come in. The commissars are going to come in and beat up you and your family and take your stove. No, it was basically we're going to phase out the manufacturing of gas stoves, and they're going to be replaced with electric ones.
And that's just going to happen.
That was all it was. And people lost their fucking minds. It was crazy to me. But yeah, it's
everything has to be a culture war issue.
Everything has to be a culture war issue. And the problem with to go back to Malcolm Gladwell, the Freakonomics guys, is their whole thing is well, this one thing was the reason for all of this shit.
Right.
And it's a very simple you know, it's like there's that great phrase about any explanation that like that is like simple, elegant, and wrong.
Yeah.
And you know, because it's much more complicated than that.
That's right.
You can't tell me that just abortions on their own led to a significant lowering of the crime rate. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? You can make the same argument that the removal of lead from products led to less neurological problems in the populace, and that led to the decline of crime. You can make the same fucking argument. Like,
a lot of things happened, and any one of them could be you can draw the line wherever you want, right?
Because correlation isn't necessarily causation.
Yeah.
And so it's probably a myriad of factors that led to certain things, you know, like the decline of crime in the United States, I think had to do with a variety of things. One, I think it did have to do with maybe the abortion rate, but it also had something to do with getting rid of lead out of the products. And also is the fact that the United States started to have much stronger draconian crime laws where they were putting more and more people in prisons. They were putting more and more people away. And so there were just less and less people out on the street to do petty crime because they were all locked up.
Yeah.
Yeah. There were fewer people. Yeah.
There was actually like, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that actually was going on that was like pro-social too, that like increased awareness about how crime came about. And
I mean, the Great Society alone, the war on poverty, you know, the development of programs like Medicaid and Head Start and you know, and WIC and TANF, or what used to be called needy dependent aid to women and children. It used to be called like WIC. Anyway, TANF, right? Like food stamps, welfare, shit like that.
Yeah.
So like, there's all kinds of things in which, you know, the decline of poverty, like like certain things, you know, I mean, the Great Society was an immense success. Any right-wing asshole who tells you that the war on poverty didn't work or that the Great Society didn't work is full of shit.
Right.
Matthew Desmond's research on this is very clear that the war on poverty lowered childhood poverty and poverty in general dramatically in a period of 10 years, like dramatically. And in fact, nearly half of all children in the United States were lifted out of poverty, out of extreme poverty, the way the poverty level is set, by the American Rescue Plan, by the COVID bill that Biden passed, where they had the extension of the childhood tax credit. Mm-hmm. And just by extending the childhood tax credit, which is one of the most progressive reforms in American government in decades, probably since the Great Society, I think it was like 46% of children were pulled out of poverty.
Right.
Overnight. Like it was almost overnight. So this idea that like we can't do that is absurd. So we can absolutely lift people out of poverty. It's a policy choice.
Yep.
So yeah, Malcolm Gladwell is ass.
We spent a lot of time on that one.
Well, because he's like with many on this list, he's a symptom of a much larger problem.
Right.
And that's why we talked about it. Number 14 is reality television.
Oh, interesting.
And I think with this one, I think he was talking a little bit about like obviously The Apprentice.
Right. Okay.
And stuff like Shark Tank, or Dragon's Den, as they call it in Britain. And what reality television does, it sort of reaffirms the glorification of the rich and the glorification of people who live wealthy in wealthy lifestyles. You know, I think of, you know, when I was a kid, you think of like, what's his name? Robin Leach,
Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous.
You know, like, and watching all these people live this kind of life and people, that sort of culture. If I were to update this list today, I would change reality television to influencers.
Right.
I would change it to sort of wealth influencers on the internet or on TikTok on the internet. I think that there are pernicious effects of the sort of rise and grind hustle culture, right? Because here's the thing about the people on the internet like that, they're sort of perpetuating that lifestyle. If they were actually wealthy, why the fuck would they be wasting their time doing any of that? This is kind of like this whole thing of like, I've got these secrets, this wealth creation package. If you just pay $9.99, that's $1,000, by the way, $9.99 for my course, you will learn the secrets about how to be wealthy.
That's your Andrew Tate.
That's your Andrew Tate. You know, that's your Grant Cardone's, who's a Scientologist. That's your Tony Robbins and like all
Right.
kind of that kind of shit, right?
Yeah.
If you just buy my course, I'm going to show you how to make money. And it's like, if you knew how to make money, why would you want to tell more people how to make money if you're good at it? Wouldn't you just want to make more money? Why
Yeah.
would you waste your
The
time?
way to make money is to con people into
It's to con
getting your
people into buying these fucking
course.
courses. Because it's definitely like a fake it till you make it. That's
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah.
Because these people don't actually know the information that you get in these courses, and I'm putting that in scare quotes because they are definitely that.
Yeah.
Is information that you could easily glean from Google for free. It's
Yeah.
not stuff. Nothing in a course is going to be unique. I mean, I think my favorite example of a shitty online influencer course is the one that Jake Paul did.
Oh, okay. I didn't know about that one.
So Jake Paul did one. God, this probably is 4 or 5 years ago now, where he set up like how to become a social media influencer, and he sold this course. And I can't remember if it was Danny Gonzalez or Drew Gooden. They're very great YouTubers who kind of dunk on these people sometimes from time to time. One of them like bought the course and like walked through what you were supposed to learn from the course. And again, it was all sort of generic bullshit. And all the videos that Jake Paul is in, he couldn't even really be bothered to be enthusiastic about it. And it looks like he's reading from like a cue card. It's all a scam. So that's what I would replace reality television with today, is sort of that influencer
culture or whatever.
Yeah. Number 15, I forget who the fuck this person is. I think it's Damien Hirst. I think he's an artist.
Okay. Yeah,
and I think
ring a bell.
Art is like really abstract postmodern shit that like rich people love. Let me see if I have that right. Let me see if I know what the hell I'm talking about here. Or he's either, yes, he's an artist.
Okay.
Damien Hirst is an English artist, and he's one of those people who sort of came up in the English art scene in the 90s and made an insane amount of money, and like sort of led to the proletarianization of art, where art was just a reflection of the vast chasms of wealth that had been developed in our hyper-capitalist societies.
No.
So yeah, that's who that would be. I don't know who we'd replace that with today. I mean, maybe I'm trying to think of like a rich asshole who does art that people like. Oh, I know exactly what we could replace Damien Hirst with. NFTs. Yep. NFTs are definitely rich people things.
That's right.
They're stupid, and they fleeced a lot of people.
Yep.
Number 16 is absolutely evergreen, and it's Ayn Rand.
Ah, yes.
We've not
very much still a rich people thing.
I really feel like maybe at some point, I'm going to get into it a little bit, but we need to do a live stream of an Ayn Rand and kind of debunk, like talking about Ayn Rand and sort of cult of Ayn Rand and all of it. Because I'm fascinated by it. As somebody who was really into Ayn Rand in college and like became a libertarian for a while and was heavily influenced by her ideas for a long time and sort of saw it from the inside.
Right.
It would be interesting to talk about that.
Yeah.
Have you ever read an Ayn Rand book?
No.
Good
no,
for you.
I thought about it. I was going to. I was like, well, everybody seems to hate this person. Maybe they're interesting. And my buddy Mike just said, don't even bother. It's just, it's like the worst philosophy you'll ever read.
It's terrible. Calling it philosophy is an insult to philosophy.
Right. It's a little, that's too generous to Ayn Rand.
All she's really doing is some rehashed Nietzscheanism with a little bit of John Locke thrown in for
right.
It's not really like unique to her. She acts as if she is like this great innovative thinker, when in reality, like she was somebody who just sort of, she was just sort of rehashing stuff that had already been done. And there's nothing really, she's extremely derivative.
Yeah.
Her books are compelling. I mean, they read like, I don't know how to describe it. They read like potboiler noir written by a sociopath. It's and so Ayn Rand is definitely rich people things, in the sense that there are a lot of regular ass people that love Ayn Rand who don't have a pot to piss in. Yeah. And her whole thing is about how the poor and the working class and those who are not affluent are sort of moochers and looters and they're the people who steal from society, when we all really know that the ultimate looters and moochers in our society are the rich.
Yeah, that's
The
right.
rich are the absolute moochers, and they get more government money than anybody. They get more government protection and privilege than anybody. They get more prestige than anybody. Like, and most of them don't have to fucking work for it, right? Like we talked about that when we talked about Bertrand Russell. We was talking about like most of these people don't even fucking work for a living because they don't have to. So yeah, I think Ayn Rand would definitely be evergreen on this list.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
She's awful. Anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I think it's good to move on. And also,
like maybe we'll spend a live stream sometime.
We could talk about Randianism and sort of why.
Consequently
says, I would love a stream on Ayn Rand because I really don't understand why people are so into her. We can absolutely do that. Yeah. We can absolutely do a live stream and talk about Rand and why Rand is so compelling. Because I think there is something there that I can understand why people would get to it. And so I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying I think I've cracked the code in figuring out why I think it's popular.
Yeah.
Because in the United States, I think like the most popular book after the Bible is Atlas Shrugged or something like that. Like there was it was like a Publishers Weekly or some kind of literary magazine did like a list of like the 100 greatest novels of the 20th century. And number one was Ulysses by James Joyce. That was like picked by the critics and the writers for the magazine. But there was also like a readers list, like people who read their magazine who voted. And on that list, the number one was Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand.
Right.
So I know, much like Scientology, I know way more about Ayn Rand than I should. And so we can definitely get into that. And how actually I think that Ayn Rand consequently says, understanding why things are compelling, especially awful things, is important so we know how to push back against it. Absolutely. Yeah. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier this week. We were talking about Nathan Robinson and him taking right-wing books seriously and critiquing them on their merits.
Yeah,
I think that's, or demerits. I think that's really important. And I think Ayn Rand is probably the most influential, like intellectual, for lack of a better word, of the political right, of the
quote unquote intellectual.
I mean, I think that she's enormously important in understanding the modern political right in this country. So, and in general. So yeah, Ayn Rand definitely evergreen on this list. Always sucks. Number 17. This one sounds counterintuitive, but it's The Memoir. The Memoir. So,
which is as in like the guy who writes a book about his life kind of thing.
Yes. So he sort of talks about how memoirs are sort of a form of narcissism, which I kind of agree with. I would change. So here's what I would, if I was going to change it, I would take because I think there actually are some memoirs or autobiographies that are good. Like I've talked about, probably one of my favorite books I read last year was Still Just a Geek by Will Wheaton, which is, I think, an incredible book and people should read it. I think that, I think the book's called I'm Glad My Mom's Dead.
Oh yeah, by Jeanette McCurdy.
That book is incredible. I highly recommend people. So I've, as a Star Trek geek, I've read, autobiographies of William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy and others. Right. So, and Patrick Stewart has one coming out in October. So, I think the memoir and the autobiography can be a good thing.
Right.
I think I would replace the memoir with the self-help book. The sort of the self-help book, because I think self-help is a much more pernicious rich people thing than the memoir is.
It very much entrenches the status quo and makes people, gives people the impression that if they just do this thing or this set of things good enough, if they just lift them, have a better attitude or whatever, then they'll be better, more successful.
Right, exactly. And again, it's kind of like the Malcolm Gladwell thing, where it's like, if you do this one thing, then your whole world's going to get better, right? And the thing is, I can't remember, I think it might have been George Carlin, where he's like, why do they call it self-help? Because you're getting it from somebody else. You're not helping yourself. Someone's helping you. It's not self-help. It's just help. Because he was always brilliant about language. It's like when people say neither here nor there, then where is it? You know,
Yeah.
or when he says like
Um,
priest,
we
yeah,
got a comment on YouTube from Levi Tucker.
the
The
self.
self-help. Go
Sorry, go
ahead.
ahead. You go ahead and
The
read. I'm
self-help
reading.
industry definitely plays into the individualist idea that you can solve systemic problems with individual effort. Yeah,
Wonderfully said.
absolutely,
Wonderfully said.
absolutely.
And if you want to like a deep dive into this, I highly recommend two books on this specifically. One is Bright Sided by Barbara Ehrenreich,
Okay,
which is an incredible book where she sort of lays out the problem with essentially like the happiness industry
right.
and like and like happiness psychology and positive psychology, like all that kind of shit. And she sort of lays out why it's pernicious. And I think the subtitle of the book is How Positive Thinking is Undermining America.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then the second book that people should check out is a book called Pound Foolish by Helene Olin.
Okay.
That book is about the problems with the financial self-help industry. People like
Ah,
what's that asshole's name? Dave Ramsey and Susie, or what's her name? Susie Orton or whatever the fuck her name is. But
okay.
basically the people who are selling like the one size fits all financial planning advice,
Right, right.
and how they're a real pernicious effect on America and actually make people crappier with money than better with money.
Mm-hmm.
And also with Dave Ramsey, I mean, and there have been a bunch of people who've talked about this before, but like he's also super religious, and a lot of like his financial planning advice like ties into like real Jesus stuff. So it's
Right.
already kind of icky from that standpoint.
Yeah.
So yeah. So yeah, I think the self-help book is probably the one I would put there,
Instead of the
rather than the
memoir.
memoir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Number 18 is the Supreme Court. I don't think this one needs that much explanation. They're
Nope.
about to fuck me with the student loan stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah, I think the Supreme Court are truly awful. They're absolutely toadies of the rich. They are
Yeah.
pawns of the rich classes who really run this country. If you need an indication, Clarence Thomas's best friend is like a billionaire who has a weird garden full of dictator statues.
If you want a good podcast that discusses the Supreme Court, Michael Hobbs's co-host on Books That Kill is also from the 5 to 4 podcast, which is about why the Supreme Court
Okay.
sucks.
Yes.
So,
There's also a book that I've recently gotten the audiobook of that I've been meaning to read called The Case Against the Supreme Court.
okay.
And it's by Erwin Chemerinsky or something like that. And yeah, I think the Supreme Court is dog shit. And when we talk later in the year, when we talk about Gore Vidal talks about how originally when the Constitution was developed, the Congress was supposed to regulate what the court does and not the other way around. So,
Right.
yeah, Supreme Court's dog shit. Number 19, I think this one is kind of one of those counterintuitive ones, but I think it makes sense, which is Higher Learning, where he talks about basically how college education and the educational system is set up to create hierarchies and vast inequalities. And he also talks about how the university system, as it's developed, especially like the Ivies, like Harvard and Princeton and Yale, they often let in people who are not even remotely qualified to be there simply by virtue of who the fuck their dad was. George W. Bush. And also the fact that Yale, I don't know if he says this in the book, but Yale is essentially the university that cultivated the architects of what would become the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows that if you go to Yale, there's a good shot you might end up working for what they call the company or the CIA.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I
think I was just gonna say, like, university, like higher education, like you say, like it's sort of become a kind of a requirement so that you can place like these are the workers that are superior to the workers down here who didn't get the education, and
you're right.
Pretty clear that it's a tool for the status quo or the those in power.
Yeah, for sure, and that goes line in line with the idea of the meritocracy too.
Yeah.
Number 20 is definitely a dated one, which would be the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, which was this big package that was passed in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008 that gave like $800 billion to the banks to keep them from completely destroying the American economy. So
it was a rich people thing for sure.
It was absolutely a rich people thing because, and he talks about how a lot of these same banks that were bailed out by the federal government ended up giving huge bonuses and
Yeah.
golden parachutes to people who were running the company. It's like,
Yeah.
so these people got rewarded for being failures. Last I
Yeah.
checked in America, you're only supposed to be rewarded if you do things right, not if you do things wrong. But last, doesn't sound too meritocratic to me.
No, that's right. Where's the meritocracy going?
Yeah, where's the meritocracy? But that's how rich people work, right? It's rules for thee, but not for me.
Yeah, that's right.
I think today the modern example of this is, in our current climate, I would say probably the bailing out of Silicon Valley Bank, and the recent bank bailouts that have happened, pretty much overnight. Again, they used the sort of architecture of TARP from 2008 to do what they did with Silicon Valley Bank and other banks when they failed, which was to just infuse them with billions of public dollars. And often what happens with these schemes is that they privatize the gains and they socialize the losses. So the people who really should take the brunt of the failure don't ever actually take it, and the people who end up getting stuck with it are the public. And so number 21 is the lobbying world.
Of course.
So I think this is right. K Street. We're thinking about, and he wrote a lot about Jack Abramoff, who was this very famous. I think Jack Abramoff is probably the most famous lobbyist that anybody's name. Like if someone said name a lobbyist, people would say Jack Abramoff. But maybe I'm old. But maybe that name's older to people. So Jack Abramoff was this lobbyist who worked on trying to get people. He kind of fucked over like Native American tribes who were trying to set up like casinos and shit. And he was a real shady guy. And so I think the lobbying world is still pretty damn terrible. I mean, I think it's really interesting that a company like Apple, for example, spends more money on lawyers than it does on research and development.
Right.
And I think that's, because a lot of the innovations of the companies that we think of, like Apple, Facebook, or Meta, whatever the fuck it wants to call itself now, Google, Alphabet, whatever, most of their best creations are ones that they bought. They were ones they never created in-house, right?
Right.
Like Instagram was something that came up originally and Facebook bought it. A lot of the technologies for like touchscreens and stuff, those were created in IBM labs,
right?
With public money. It was all ARPA funded. It was all DARPA funded stuff.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the technologies that we sort of take for granted are actually stuff that we kind of paid for as taxpayers.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm going to skip 22 real quick, and I'm going to go back to 23 because on this list he puts the iPad.
Okay.
I think today we would probably put the Tesla and explain why. So the reason why he put the iPad is he talked about how the iPad is this like consumer good that actually they're fairly cheap now, and they were more expensive when he was writing this, so they were kind of more for the well-to-do.
For sure.
But now they're fairly cheap, although some of them are still fairly expensive. But he talks about how they're built upon horrible labor. So he uses the iPad as a means of talking about how companies have what's called lean production, where they own the intellectual property, but then the companies that they contract out to make their goods, they don't actually own. So like Foxconn is a company that makes a lot of the Apple products, but Apple doesn't own Foxconn. It just contracts them out to sell this stuff or to make this stuff. And so he talked about the horrific, labor conditions of people in China who make Apple products or electronic products in general. He talked obviously about the suicide nets,
right.
And how these are like horrible instances where it's actually in some forms a form of debt slavery, where these people someone sponsors them to go work in another country, and then they can't really pay off their debts. And so they're sort of beholden to the contract and can't get out of it because they're not making enough to get out of the contract. So it's kind of a form of indentured servitude under these certain labor standards. So I think we would use the Tesla today in talking about how the Tesla is like this symbol of sort of opulence and wealth, and it's seen as like this is the future, when in reality all of the heavy metals and elements that go into making all those batteries are largely mined out of places in Africa and Latin America by children who are often then exposed to horrible toxins like lead. I think it's highlighting the difference between the ideal and the real of how terrible labor exploitation can be.
Yeah, for sure.
Number
But
22. Yeah.
No, I
Go
was
ahead.
just thinking, but it's not. Yeah, the Tesla is definitely a much more up to date version of it, right?
Yep. I think so. Number 22 is libertarianism, which kind of goes hand in hand with Ayn Rand. I don't really know why he separated these two out. I would have just
Right.
done them together.
Yeah.
But yeah, libertarianism is obviously awful, and we recognize that this idea that, I mean, the problem with libertarianism is that it's sort of it's a myth. Like it's kind of utopian thinking where they think that if everybody's just left to their own selfish devices, we'll create the best society possible. And
Right.
it's like
The free
and
market will take care of
the
everybody.
free market will take care of everything, is because they think people are selfish. But then they're like, but then people are charitable, right? And they'll use their money. And it's like, but that's not really how it works. I mean,
No.
so that's why when we were talking earlier about sort of libertarian socialism, it's why I don't like to use the word, because libertarianism has been sort of destroyed by the right wing. And so I don't want to lead with telling people that I'm a libertarian, because they've poisoned the well on it, very much like they've poisoned the well on things like free speech. They've done that too.
Yeah. They're trying to ruin anarchists.
And now they're trying to, good for you. Good for you. Free speech is another one of those, like in quotes, I would put on the rich people things list.
Yeah.
The weaponization of free speech in service of elites. Number 24, again, the next two are kind of dated. I think we would update them with different people. Number 24 is Steve Forbes, and number 25 is Alan Greenspan. So Steve Forbes is a magazine editor. I don't think he's the founder but he's one of the leading editors of Forbes magazine. So the Forbes 500 list or the Forbes 400.
Sorry to interrupt. We have
good.
A comment about libertarianism from Levi. What they call libertarianism, I just call neo-feudalism.
Absolutely.
Spot on.
Absolutely. Yep. I think it's exactly right. Or fascism. Because what is fascism but the complete melding of corporate and state power?
Yeah. Which is what you have if you have capitalism without a state.
Yep. So libertarianism will dissolve into fascism. And you need any indication of that, think of something like the Mises Caucus in the modern Libertarian Party, which is extremely reactionary and borderline fascist. I think the libertarian movement has gotten so fashy that people are starting to leave it. Most notably, I mean, I think one of them is Penn Jillette, who is a libertarian, has been a libertarian for decades, and was very upset about the ways in which libertarians were shitty about mask mandates, and they were shitty about vaccines, and it was just gross. So Steve Forbes, runs Forbes magazine, glorification of the rich. These are the same kind of fucking people that put, scammers and scumbags like, Elizabeth Holmes and Sam Bankman-Fried and whatever. Alan Greenspan's the former chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Former?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he hasn't been in the role since 2006.
Okay.
The current chairman of the Federal Reserve is Jerome Powell. It was, I'm trying to remember now. So it was after.
So for that one, you could just put Jerome Powell in.
You could put Jerome Powell. And basically that, and the reason he put Alan Greenspan is because Alan Greenspan was an Ayn Rand acolyte.
Oh, yeah.
And basically believed that the market could be this perfect logical thing that could run basically like God.
Right.
These people see the market as a God. That it can kind of do all things.
Yeah, the invisible hand and all that.
Literally, they treat it like a God. I mean, somebody tweeted out something like, the free market didn't fail us; we failed the free market. That's religious language. That's not. Yeah, that's right. It's not reasonable discourse. So we would put Jerome Powell on that list today, or Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary, or whoever's at the head of Bank of England, or whatever.
Right.
Steve Forbes, I think we'd probably replace today with Elon Musk. I think Elon Musk would be on this list of rich people things, of people who are just absolute trash and suck.
and promote like the worst ideas and like, yeah,
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
and talks a good fucking game about like free speech and shit, and then silence dissenters who criticize Modi's government in India. So
And now is like banning people from Twitter because they use the term cis or
yeah,
cisgendered. So
but yet somehow people saying the N word's not a problem. I
yeah,
mean,
that's right.
it's either apply rules consistently or don't. If you say that you're a free speech absolutist, then you let anybody say anything on your fucking platform.
Yeah, that's
That's
right.
the way that
If
goes.
you're gonna have rules, then okay, lay them
And
out. Tell us what they are.
lay out clearly that people can say what they want. And there are certain instances where it could be against the law, like say if it's libel, where you're libeling someone, or
Right.
actual harassment, which would be under certain laws. You can make a clear argument like these are the things we do not allow based on legal statutes.
Yeah.
Everything else is fair game, but they don't fucking do that because again, it's rules for me and not for thee.
Yeah.
Or rules for thee, but not for me. It's always this constant double standard because Elon Musk is a moron.
Yeah.
And also just somebody who overpromises and underdelivers,
Right.
which is what Alan Greenspan did, where he basically said that the economy would be perfect forever and we've hit a perfect equilibrium. And
And
yeah.
then in 2008, it just shit
it
the bed.
absolutely took a huge shit. So yeah, so I think that's who. And the last one is, we're kind of ending on a not so exciting one, but the last one is The Sporting Life. And
As
basically
in like fishing and hunting.
fishing and hunting, or like people who fight big game and shit. And
Okay.
like I think those are pretty awful, and we can talk about how like hunting big game is kind of gross, and or we can also talk about The Sporting Life in the sense of like sports where we're talking about like stadiums, like the public financing of
Right.
stadiums, even though the billionaires own the fucking teams that could pay for it.
Yeah.
And how the economic benefits of public financing of these stadiums or other kind of things don't often pan out. They're often pretty terrible. So yeah, I think, and I feel like in the newer edition, he had tax cuts as one of his rich people things,
Okay.
which is definitely a rich people thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like Frank Gehry was another person he had put on the new rich people list. Frank Gehry's an architect. He's best known for like the Guggenheim building in New York City and the Museum of Popular Culture in Seattle, and like these big, weird looking fucking postmodern buildings that are behemoths that are very difficult to maintain, and sort of they don't serve they're not proletarian buildings, to say the least. They're the exact opposite of Soviet. So that's pretty much the list. I think in terms of who we would add to the list, I mean, I think Elon Musk would definitely be somebody we'd add on the list. Jordan Peterson would be somebody we'd add on the list. I'm trying to think who else might be on the list. But like NFTs would be, cryptocurrency is a rich people thing.
Although I do know some people who would argue against me on that one, but
I'm sorry. I'm very much, here's my whole thing. If are you buying it as a currency, or are you buying it as an asset or a commodity?
Right.
It's not a currency. I can't go into 7-Eleven and buy something.
It's a stock.
It's a stock. And the thing is that at least with a stock, it's backed up by a company that might do something.
Right.
Cryptocurrency is pure bullshit.
It's all speculation.
It is absolute the literal embodiment, the peak of commodity fetishism. It's literally nothing.
Yeah.
And so I think that this idea, again, it's this libertarian thing of like, well, it's giving it back to the people, or it's this like faux populism. It's like, no, it's not populist. It's deeply elitist and reactionary. It's crap. And yeah, I think that if you need any indication of that, I mean, look at the collapse of FTX. I mean, FTX was basically a giant Ponzi scheme.
Right.
And where it was new money was paying off the old money.
Yeah.
And it was a trick as old as time. But instead of doing we're selling you this gold star product, it's we're going to give you the best crypto experience possible. Or, I mean, I remember, or NFTs. I mean, they're so stupid. I mean, it's
NFTs amazing. Are even like, they're like crypto, but like 100 times stupider.
Yeah, they're even worse because like all I have to do is take a fucking screen cap of your stupid ape or whatever, or the Trump NFTs, which are my favorite because he used images from like Getty Images they didn't even license, so they had
Right.
watermarks and shit on them, which is very funny. That's very on brand for Trump.
Of
Trump
course.
would be on this list for sure. If we were going to do the list now,
Yeah.
Trump
yeah.
would be on the list.
Yep. Very much so.
And so much so that he would either be the first one on the list or the last one. I think he's that important because I think Trump is an embodiment of all of the terrible rich people things kind of all together.
Yeah.
And yeah, so yeah, I mean, so what else do you think might be included on the rich people things list?
How about like space tourism?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. So we would just put Blue Origin. Blue Origin.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. I think space tourism is a great example of this.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that this idea that everything is so terrible on Earth, we can't make it any better, so let's just fucking leave.
Yeah, let's
really
colonize another planet.
It's like it's a really sad way of looking at the world, and it has such disregard for like humanity and disregard for the natural world, and the Earth is a beautiful home for all of us because it's the only home we've ever known, as Carl Sagan called it. It's literally space tourism, and the ethos behind it is the complete opposite of what Carl Sagan was trying to say with the pale blue dot. Like it's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And so yeah, asshats, absolute asshats.
Yeah.
There's a great I can't remember what I listened to, but there was an episode of something I listened to about space tourism where Jeff Bezos was talking about how I literally had too much money and I didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
So I threw it into space.
And I can't pay a living wage.
I can't pay a living wage.
Obviously, that's off the table.
I can't give up making my employees piss in bottles and shit in bags.
Yeah, no.
I can't have trucks with working air conditioning. I can't do any of the things that would benefit my company.
No.
But I can throw it into making these absurd dick rockets.
Yeah, that's right.
And look, I got my Star Trek on. I love space exploration. Humans are not like the idea that we should leave planet Earth in the long term is generally a good thing. I like the idea of us becoming an interstellar species where we find other livable planets and we meet other people and we live that universe. I very much believe in that because I think it's kind of the only thing that might connect the human race together. Is if we find out that we're not alone in the universe and that we have a shared responsibility to one another. I could be wrong about that, but there's something about that I find very hopeful.
Yep.
But it ain't it. But Blue Origin ain't it. You know, Virgin Galactic or SpaceX or whatever. None of those are really it. They're all crap.
Yeah, they're all trash.
They're all garbage.
Emitting like fucking thousands of people's worth of emissions in a matter of minutes. Just
atrocious. I mean, and the thing about the Tesla one that blew up in Texas is that where it ended up fucking crashing and shit's probably gonna end up being an EPA Superfund site. Like it's
right.
fucking toxic. Like it's you know,
of course.
And yeah, it's a heartbreaking to know that the space shuttle program, when it was retired in 2010, 2011, never came back. That NASA never decided to have a shuttle program and that we just did it all with fucking SpaceX. And it's like, you know, yeah, it's really depressing. It's the space exploration, which once, you know, the first person in space was not a rich man. It wasn't a Jeff Bezos, wasn't Elon Musk. It was Yuri Gagarin. The first man in space was from the Soviet Union, and he grew up on a farm. His parents were essentially sharecroppers. They were peasants. And he was a working class person who was the first person in the stars. I find that kind of beautiful. And I don't think we should get away from that. I find that really beautiful. And I think that's something we shouldn't abandon. The idea that the rich are the only people who get to go into space is nonsense.
Yeah.
So those are any other things we might put on the list. I mean, like I'm trying to think. I mean, I think the metaverse is like a rich people thing. Like I think it's a stupid ass.
Is it still a thing?
Is it still a thing? I mean, it's really remarkable to me that this is the problem I have with capitalism, is that we let people who got lucky once then dictate shit for decades. You know,
Right. Yeah.
Bill Gates got lucky once with Microsoft and it built everything. Elon Musk got lucky once with PayPal and it built everything. And Mark Zuckerberg got lucky once with Facebook. And they can't, and more so Musk and Zuckerberg than Gates. They can't seem to do anything original worth a shit.
Right.
You know, because SpaceX kind of sucks. They're not particularly good at putting people in space.
Nope.
And the vast majority of it, they don't even end up outside of low Earth orbit. So they're not really in space. It's like fake space. And with Zuckerberg, he sucks. Like why would I trust him to do anything? I mean, you know, again, most of the things about Facebook that are successful, they either bought or stole from other companies, right? If you want more on this kind of subject, I highly recommend one of the people I truly love, who is very much an influence on me, and that's Adam Conover. I love Adam Conover. He's doing a video series now on his YouTube channel alongside his podcast, where he lays out, he's basically like, billionaires are idiots, and he kind of lays out why they're idiots. And talks about how Musk and Zuckerberg and Bezos and all these people are utter trash, and most of them are morons. Although I think Bezos is a lot smarter than these other guys. But that's because he's much more of like a pure bloodthirsty capitalist than the other ones are. He doesn't really have any pretensions in the way that, like, you know, he's not saying I'm going to change the fucking world. Or if he does, it's I'm going to make Elysium where I let the rich people all live in astro colonies and and he said something along the lines of like, we're going to create like a space station above where people can live, and we're going to turn the Earth into a nature preserve. And I'm like, what about the billions of people who are still going to live on planet Earth? Are we going to be part of the nature
You're
preserve?
not taking us all, are you?
Are you killing us or putting us in a human zoo? Which one is it? So yeah, that's rich people things.
Cool.
We can definitely open up for questions, or we can also finish up if you're
I think I better call her a night, but
we can certainly finish up then. But this has been fun, kind of going through this list and kind of chatting about how the rich ruin everything, and how capitalism essentially ruins everything.
For sure.
So thanks, man, for keep plugging along tonight, even if you're not feeling so hot.
No,
and I hope you get better.
Fun chat.
It was really fun.
So I guess before we go, are we going to do another live stream sometime, you think?
Probably soon. I'm not sure exactly when, but we'll definitely do one soon. I was thinking about maybe getting a schedule together where we do maybe one a month.
That'd be cool.
Hopefully that's a frequency that works. Maybe not too little, but
like every second time that we record Red Reviews, then we can also do a live stream.
We could do a live stream too. But I'd like to do more. For those who've watched tonight, send in your topics. If there are things that you'd like us to cover in the live stream, obviously we can definitely do a live stream talking about Ayn Rand. We can do, live stream on any topics that you're interested in. We might also we also will use the live streams to talk about stuff we're reading or things we're talking about. Maybe a live stream, Corey will bring something that he's checked out that he wants to talk about. So not to say that I don't love talking, I do, but just it's sometimes I'm like, well, maybe we'll check out something he put together. So definitely we'll try to do one again soon. I would like to do one soon, but we'll try to do one at least maybe one a month that we can kind of get out to folks and so that they can enjoy. And thanks to everybody who watched tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you for your comments, your questions, and it was great.
Very cool. I guess before we go, where can people find you online?
So you can find me at justinclark.org. It's my little website right down there.
Yep.
I love having this little feature now.
That's cool.
And you can find everything there. I've got a couple new blog posts up at the blog, one on Christopher Hitchens and one on Bertrand Russell. You can also check me out on social media at Justin Clark PH. PH stands for Public History. That's where I post updates about the blog, the podcast, what books I'm reading outside of the podcast, and so on. And also, I highly encourage people to become a patron. because Corey does a tremendous amount of work for this show, and my man needs some money. A little bit of money
Can
would
always
go a
use
long
money.
way.
Yeah,
You know,
that's right.
And so, to help continue bringing this high quality content to you,
That's right.
we want to make sure that we get you some patrons for sure.
Yeah.
And again, thank you for those who are patrons, and we
Yes.
appreciate your support.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, non-sequently said thank you for streaming. Well, thank you for joining us.
For joining us. Appreciate it. I immensely appreciate it. Yeah.
Everybody have a good night.
Thanks. See ya.